Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we have a screencast on 1950s imperialism between the United States and Iran. And as always, we're looking to use our historical goggles to see what we can learn from the situation to apply it to the positive past and avoid the potential negative future, um, or vice versa, anyway. So let's get started. Now, to learn the story of U.S. imperialism in Iran, we got to understand it within the context of the Cold War. So, post World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union got into this abstract concept of hatred. They were competing for control of their percentage of the world. And it wasn't just them, it was them and their allies. But one point of view during the Cold War was that the United States got into lots of conflicts and lots of fights, but it was to protect the world from evil communism that was trying to take it over. And that made the world very happy, at least the first world, that the United States was leading that battle. But there is another point of view, and that other point of view is that the United States and its allies got into lots of conflicts, but it was because of acts of imperialism. Capitalism needs countries to conquer others, to have allies and also resources and places to sell their goods. And those acts of imperialism was really the U.S. trying to get control of resources and to control the world and and remake the world in its image. So a lot of the world did not like that expansionist, imperialistic attitude of the United States. And obviously, depending on what your historical perspective is, you could lean one way or the other for that to subscribe to one of those points of view. Now, one example of imperialism in the United States, or at least that point of view, was U.S. imperialism in Iran in the 1950s. Now, the story of this begins, of course, in Iran, but as early as 1900, scientists had located in the middle of the deserts of Iran oil underneath all of that sand. That's very difficult to get oil. It's a massively complicated process, and Iran needed help to get the oil. They didn't have the technology or the infrastructure to do it, and so one of the more industrialized countries of the world, made a deal with them, and that would be Great Britain, to bring in that technology, that know-how, that equipment, and to get the oil out of their sands and whatnot. Now, Great Britain is going to build an entire industry and infrastructure, and of course, that's going to get the oil out and make the oil able to be transported around the world. It's a very profitable business. But the thing about it was that over this time, as Britain developed this ability to get the oil from the Iranian land, they were the ones making the majority of the money. And the Iranian people made less than 25% of the proceeds from all of this. And Iran basically, over time, was not very happy with this. Much of Iran was a third world country with very little money or development, and the fact that their resources were being used by white imperialist powers, it doesn't seem entirely fair. So from 1910 to 1953, agitation and anger and frustration will grow, and kind of this internal fight begins about the role of outsiders taking oil from Iran, and capitalizing on that money, of course. Now, the king of Iran and the kings of Iran were called shahs, but the Shah is going to basically be very friendly with the British and advocate for their continued heavy involvement in getting the oil, and for them to be profitable by it. Now, the prime minister of Iran, which is of course different from the king, is a guy named Mohammad Mossadegh. And Mossadegh is going to advocate for basically kicking all foreigners out, and Iranian oil and money should be in the hands of Iranians. So in 1950, Mohammad Mossadegh, prime minister, he gets an idea and he says, I want to nationalize all of the oil industry, and I'm going to pass a law to do it. So he nationalizes, which is a fancy word of saying, well, it's this land, this oil industry is technically in Iran, so Iran technically has the right to have it. So Iran does exactly that. It takes that land, and it means the oil wells and the oil factories and all the infrastructure, and the British basically get minimally compensated and kicked out of Iran. They lose all of it, right? So Britain not entirely happy in 1950. They just got, really, they're a major source of income, but all of the work they had done taken away. But also, Mohammad Mossadegh passed another law, which is relevant, which gave him dictatorial powers at this point. He saw the Shah as an enemy and the supporters of the Shah as the enemy, and he basically used his dictatorial powers to basically get Iran into a good, powerful spot. He took away the personal budget, mostly of the Shah, and took away a heavy percentage of the crown's land, the Shah's land, and he even passed a law saying that the Shah wasn't welcome to negotiate or connect with any foreign diplomats, which was a huge source of power for the Shah. So the Shah basically was turned into a figurehead, a very weak figure. So that said, the United States are not all that happy with the situation because Mohammad Mossadegh seemed to be switching teams. And by switching teams, now that we were a couple years into the Cold War, um, Iran was friends with Britain. It now seems to be making small agreements and developing a strong friendship with the Soviet Union. And that is very, very important that the United States felt they needed to keep oil in Western hands, particularly Iranian oil, because there's a lot of oil there. The fact that that oil might be under the control of the Soviet Union was a huge Cold War threat. Also, Mohammad Mossadegh definitely was allowing one particular party in Iran greater influence, and that would be the Communist Tudeh Party, which was gaining influence, yes. Perhaps the United States exaggerated what this influence was, but still it was perceived as a threat. Now, President Truman was only a few years out of World War II, and he ultimately said, what should we do about this? I don't want to get involved. I don't need this to turn into a world war or anything. So Truman basically kind of lets these developments continue, where Shah loses power, the prime minister gains power. But as of 1953, we have a new leader. Truman has decided not to run, and Dwight David Eisenhower, hero of D-Day, takes over as president. But now he's a Republican, a little bit more conservative. So anyway, Eisenhower at this point is definitely getting frightened in the Cold War way. The U.S. lost China in 1949, a couple years before, and that meant 1/5 of the world switched teams. They were now communist enemies, and everybody hated Truman and the Democrats for it. So that's a nice lesson. So Eisenhower knows that he cannot let any land turn communist, never mind the oil lands of Iran. So he needs to stop them. Now, again, this is all about power, right? So covert operations begin, and Eisenhower orders the CIA to basically, get rid of Mossadegh, the prime minister that's leaning towards the Russians, and put the Shah back in power, who basically is allied with the Westerners. So that's what Eisenhower does. So he gets the CIA to basically put together a plan, and the top CIA person in Iran at the time was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., who was one of the sons of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, the CIA at this point put into plan under Eisenhower's orders Operation Ajax. Now, Operation Ajax, what could that possibly be? It basically is going to be to overthrow the prime minister. So on August 15th, 1953, the United States gives a ton of money under Operation Ajax to the most powerful mobsters in Iran, two in particular, and when they get bribed, they're going to put together pro-Shah protests of all of their followers, which at the same time were anti-protests against Mossadegh. At the same time, the United States is going to give tons of money and buy off the leaders of the military. And those leaders of the military are going to bring up the military equipment, and they are going to storm government buildings, looking for any supporters of Mossadegh. And they're even going to fire on Mossadegh's home, which led him and his family to flee. So the United States at this point is also going to organize, bribe, and pay regular protesters, and they're going to put them on school buses and ship them in to the middle of the Capitol. And they took over the streets. This is a literal picture from this protest. People that the U.S. shipped in, and there they are, going building to building, leading a little revolution. Now, Mossadegh's supporters, because you can't run a country by yourself, all get captured and imprisoned. Some of them are even given the death penalty. And at this point, anybody who's resisting this movement met some level of death and attack. And people did resist. And over 200 to 300 supporters of the government and Mossadegh lost their lives in this little revolution, this little coup. So that's going to make a lot of people upset because, of course, the U.S. staged this protest, right, with their bribes and influence. So Mohammad Mossadegh was hiding, but they found him. They arrested him. Here he is getting arrested. He's going to be tried for treason and convicted, sentenced to death. But ultimately, when the Shah comes back, he commutes that sentence to 3 years. And once he gets out, Mossadegh's going to spend the rest of his life under house arrest, alive out of jail, but in his home and unable to leave. So at this point, the Shah does return. He had fled during these acts of violence and this revolution, but he comes back and he's going to be put in power. And over the next 20 years, he's going to rule Iran with all of his powers back and then some. It's a huge victory for the Western powers, particularly the U.S. and Britain. And the legacy of this Iranian coup is a couple things. Number one, starting in 1954, Great Britain is going to sign a treaty with the Shah, and that treaty is going to put oil back in Western hands, pretty much at a 50-50 ratio, which is still massively profitable for the Western powers, and even the U.S. is going to get involved. Iranian oil, of course, is kept out of Soviet hands, and that's a huge win. It's a nice legacy. Number two, The Shah is going to rule for approximately the next 20 years-ish, and you could argue that Mossadegh being deposed is an attack on democracy, that the Shah was not representing his people's interests. Some people said that he was abusive as he westernized the country and made it very secular. He's going to be corrupt, his administration. The Iranian people are going to be stuck in poverty. The Shah is going to do very little to help them, including funneling these massive profits over to Western powers over the oil. Anybody that's perceived as an enemy, the Shah is going to absolutely use kind of a secret police to capture and torture them, violating their rights per se. And the Shah is ultimately going to be kind of a puppet of Western powers. They did put him back in power after all. And he's not always going to be working for his own people, but perhaps for them. And that's going to make the people of Iran not necessarily happy. And that happiness is going to fade and anger going to grow. So kind of a consequence as this anger grows, and 20 years goes by about, in 1978, the Iranian people, through their anger, are going to have a revolution, basically violently rise up to kick the Shah out of power. The Shah indeed is going to flee. He's going to flee to the United States, and the Iranian people that now have taken over demand him to come back. But the U.S. refuses to send him back. They would have put him on trial, and they would have hung him. And one of the reasons is the Shah was dying of cancer at this point in a U.S. hospital. And the U.S. was like, nope, this is a friend for 20 years. We're not going to send him back to get killed. He eventually dies, and then they couldn't get him back. And there was such anger that the Iranian people stormed the U.S. embassy, took 66 U.S. hostages, and no matter what President Jimmy Carter of the U.S. did, we could not free these hostages for well over a year. And that's going to create a terrible, terrible time period in U.S. history where the U.S. felt absolutely impotent and weak. So that said, not so good for the U.S. Another legacy of this coup is Middle Eastern resentment. The Middle East is not going to be happy. There's going to be filled with much anger. Eventually, it's going to come out that the U.S. played this strong role in deposing their leader and controlling them. And that perception that the U.S., through imperialism, is manipulating the Middle Eastern people and stealing their money and resources is going to lead to a lot of hate. Now, it's so much more complicated than that. But when you lose the room, when you lose a region that now thinks less of you, that's less power, less influence. When much of the world hates you, you're going to be able to control less of it. And control is power and well-being. So could you argue that this was one of the first steps towards hatred developing against the U.S. in the Middle East? Could that hatred eventually accumulate into 9/11? Perhaps. Could that hatred have led to all the conflicts that were necessary in Iraq, the 2 Iraqi wars? What about the wars in Afghanistan? So without a doubt, this was definitely a huge step towards creating that angst and anger in the Middle East, which would result in lots of conflicts for the U.S. Kind of a fourth legacy of the coup, the CIA became overconfident. I mean, let's face it. Right around this time, they had led 2 successful revolutions. They had gotten rid of the leaders of Iran and Guatemala. And just with these revolutions, I mean, think about an organization being powerful enough to take over a country per se. So the CIA basically started to feel that they were invincible. And what does that mean? Well, basically in the year 1961, the CIA is going to realize that they have a communist leader in Cuba by the name of Fidel Castro. And the CIA is going to lead to a very similar invasion to what they had previously done, because Cuba was now loving them some communism, and the CIA is going to invade in a place called Bay of Pigs with some Cuban exiles. Cuba's going to get real nervous after our invasion. They don't want the U.S. to attack again, so they ask the Soviet Union for nukes, and the Soviet Union gives them nukes. And now that's going to lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States came the closest they've ever come to basically getting blown up by nuclear weapons. And that's going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one can argue that that's the CIA who did that invasion of Cuba, trying to take over Cuba from Fidel Castro, the communist. They only gained the confidence to do that after the Iranian victory. So that overconfidence did lead somewhere. So number 5, in 2013, President Barack Obama did for the first time acknowledge the United States' role in overthrowing a democratically elected Iranian government. This was the first time that we said, I'm sorry. And of course, there's an amount of forgiveness that was a long time coming, a very positive thing to occur in 2013. But again, this is all a story of imperialism, and we very much have to see what we can learn from it. So there's an essential question that comes out of this, and that is, was the United States wrong to secretly take steps to overthrow a foreign leader that was perceived to act against the best interests of the United States? So when you have a foreign leader in a foreign country, that's doing things that are potentially going to hurt your country, does it justify you taking steps to remove them? Or is that unfair influence of another country? Are you impacting their sovereignty and their freedom by messing with them when you should just mind your own business? And of course, that is a age-old debate about the legitimacy of imperialism and influence. When you're elected to lead your country, do you need to do everything necessary to protect the well-being of your country, even terrible and immoral things like this? And I would think you should reflect on that. And of course, an answer from the time of 1950s, I think, would be very different from today. So ultimately, thank you for listening, and hopefully we've learned kind of about the 1953 Iranian coup and the U.S. role in it. Hopefully we can draw some conclusions to build towards a more positive future and a less negative future as well. All right, thank you so much. Enjoy your day.